Okay, great. We're going to get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the November Literary Modiin author event. My name is Julie Zuckerman. I am the author of the Book of Jeremiah. And before we get started, I have a few words of introduction. Some of you are veterans here and you know my whole little spiel at the beginning, but for those of you who it's your first time and who aren't familiar with Modiin, it's a planned city in Israel, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And we're right near the airport, which has just reopened to tourists, so come visit. Anyway, back to Literary Modiin, we have a large population of English speakers here. So in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large community of readers here. We had a few in-person events, and then when the pandemic hit, we switched to a virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and welcome attendees from all over the world. I'm gonna, for 1 second, just share my screen so you can see some of the other books of authors we hosted. Hang on, where is it? And we have a lot of our former authors are on this call tonight, so welcome everyone. Just scrolling down. Tomorrow I'm going to send out the recording of this evening, as well as a link to this page where you can see all of the books of authors we've hosted. So there's quite a lot by now. I think I don't remember what number event this is, but maybe 17th or 18th. Anyway. A few words about the format of tonight. It's each author will be speaking for 15 minutes and then we'll open it up to questions. Everyone is on mute, so you can put your questions in the chat box. And if you have technical difficulties, just send a private note, a private chat to me. So, okay, now I'm very happy to introduce our first author. Hilma Wolitzer is a recipient of the Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships, an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, and a Barnes & Noble Writers for Writers Award. She has taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, New York University, Columbia University, and the Breadloaf Writers Conference. Her first published story appeared when she was 36, and her first novel 8 years later. Her many stories and novels have drawn critical praise for illuminating the dark interiors of the American home. Today, A Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket is her 15th book, I think, and she lives in New York City. So Hilma, take it away. I'm going to spotlight you, and you have to
I am
unmute yourself.
I did.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Great.
Go ahead, you can go ahead.
May I begin? Thank you. Julie, thank you so much for inviting me. This is quite exciting, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here with Iddo and Aviya. It's a wonderful thing, and I say today, for you it's tonight, am I right? It's still afternoon here in New York. I'm going to speak a little bit about how I became a writer. I was a late bloomer. My first novel was published, as I believe Julie said, when I was 44. And my younger daughter, Meg, is a novelist whose first novel was published at 22. And I think that speaks to the difference in the way women's lives were when she began writing and when I began writing. To begin with, I didn't grow up in a literary household. I grew up in Brooklyn during the Great Depression. And I think there were just a couple of books in the house. There were an ancient set of encyclopedia, and there was the Dr. Morris Fishbine's Home Medical Advisor. So I really became a hypochondriac before I became a writer. But there was a lovely oral tradition in our household. It was the 3-generation household, and uncles and aunts lived nearby, and everybody was always visiting. And I remember lying on the floor under the kitchen table, eavesdropping. And there was so much laughter, and there were wonderful anecdotes, and they spoke in Yiddish, and they spoke in broken English, and they spoke in Pig Latin when they didn't want me to understand what they were saying. But for me, this was the beginning of narrative. I really felt as if I was being led into a different kind of world. And I began writing really bad poetry as a child, and no one paid much attention to it until my mother went to have a parent-teacher conference. I think I was in the 4th grade with my teacher, Miss Fredericks, and she came home glowing. And she told my father that Miss Fredericks had said that Hilma shows great promise. And after that, my parents took my terrible poems more seriously. They played cards a couple of times a week, and they invited me to recite my poetry for the card players who couldn't have been less interested. They couldn't wait to get to the next hand, but they were very polite and they applauded. And that was the beginning for me. I thought it was quite wonderful. When I got into bed and they were shuffling the cards, it sounded like an echo of the applause. And flash forward about 40 or 50 years later, I was a published writer. I was giving a reading in a library in New Jersey, and a very old woman came up afterward and said, "You don't remember me, but I was your 4th grade teacher, Miss Fredericks." And I began gushing. "You don't know how you've changed my life, how you influenced me, how you gave me confidence, because you told my mother that I showed great promise." And she said, "Oh, honey, I told that to all the parents." So that really put me in my place. And as I said, I was raised really by a housewife to be a housewife. And I got married young. I didn't go to college. I got married young. I had children, and I became very involved in my domestic life. I made towering Jell-O molds, very fancy things. I entertained my husband's colleagues at dinner parties. He was a psychologist. We had 2 children. We had a dog. Life was very full, and I actually enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed my domestic life. I loved being a wife and mother, but I also felt restless. I felt as if there was something else I wanted to do. I wasn't quite sure what it was. And then the second wave of feminism came, and I read those books by those women who were the pioneers. And I realized that I could do something else. And the thing I wanted to do was write. And I began to write, and I began to write about what I knew, which was family life. And fortunately, it was a valid literary subject. And I began to publish as well, which was quite thrilling. And our daughter claims that I was a big influence because she saw that I could do it, and that if I could do it, she might be able to do it. And she claims I said you can do anything you want, which was true. But I think she was also a born writer, as I think my older daughter, Nancy, was a born artist. And I started out as a visual artist, actually, myself. So it's kind of thrilling when your children do what you do. It's actually, it's not competitive at all. It's really very, I say the apples not only fell from the tree, but they rose above the tree. They took wings, excuse me. But I didn't expect to have a book out at 91. I thought I had retired from writing. My husband and I had a companionable life. We enjoyed ourselves. I was writing a few poems again, better than the ones I wrote when I was a child, and even publishing them. But then COVID struck, and both my husband and I, at the beginning of the pandemic, came down with COVID and were hospitalized in separate hospitals. And he died 2 days before I was released from the hospital. And while this was happening, our younger daughter, the writer, was reading some of my old short stories, and many of them were 50 years old, or about 50 years old. And she said, "Mom, you really should collect these." I had had 9 novels and 4 books for children and a guide to writing, but I'd never had a collection of stories. And I wasn't interested at all. I still felt too sick, and I was extremely sad. And she even petitioned my agent about it. She sent him the stories and said, don't you think this should be a book? And I began to realize that I needed something to do beside grieve, and I needed something to look forward to. Even at 91, you need something to look forward to. You don't just look backward, you look ahead. And so I became involved. But when I looked over the stories, I realized something was missing. And that was what had happened to my husband and me. And even though I never wrote autobiographically, I wrote about a couple named Howard and Paulette, whose lives mirrored our own, in that they married young, had children, and had all the struggles and joys of married life. But it wasn't about us. I protected our privacy. But after my husband died, I felt compelled to put down our story, but to also disguise it. And I call it truth wrapped in a lie, which is what I think most fiction is anyway. And Emily Dickinson said, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And that's what I tried to do. But there are many details in that story, The Great Escape, that are actually true. And I thought I'd read a little bit from it. And from that particular story, which is the final story in the book and the only new one. I used to look at Howard first thing in the morning to see if he was awake too, and if he wanted to get something going before one of the kids crashed into the room and plopped down between us like an Amish bundling board. Lately, though, with the children long grown and gone to their own marriage beds, I found myself glancing over to see if Howard was still alive, holding my breath while I watched for the shallow rise and fall of his, the way I had once watched for a promising rise in the bedclothes. Whenever I saw that he was breathing and that the weather waited just behind the blinds to be let in, I felt an irrational surge of happiness. Another day, and then another, and another, and another. Breakfast, vitamins, pills, argument, blood pressure pills, lunch, doctor, cholesterol medicine, the telephone, supper, TV, sleeping pills, sleep, waking. It seemed as if it would all go on forever in that exquisitely boring and beautiful way, but of course it wouldn't. Everyone knows that. There were running death jokes in our family. My father driving past the cemetery. Everybody's dying to get in. My mother, death must be great. Nobody ever comes back. Howard's mother, when one of us dies, I'm going to Florida. That would have been funny, except that she actually meant it. Now, none of them was laughing or ever coming back. And I think I wrote the story as a way of grieving as well, because after COVID, the usual rituals of grieving, a funeral, sitting shiva, being with your family, being with friends, everything was denied us. I came out of the hospital alone, and all the artifacts of my husband and my life were there. His shoes were still next to the bed. His reading glasses were on the bed. He had several pair from the drugstore. He took one pair to the hospital. I was running around when the EMT guys came, and with the gurney for him, they put an oxygen mask on him, and they were shouting at me, get his pajamas, get his charger, get his phone. I couldn't even find matching pajamas, which stupidly bothered me. And I ran after them. I ran after the gurney. We live in a high-rise in Manhattan. And I realized I never said goodbye to him. I never kissed him. I never said anything until the doors closed, and then it was too late. And then when I came home and found everything just as we had left it, except that he wasn't there, it wasn't as if he had died so much as if he had vanished, as if he had been kidnapped or fallen through a trapdoor. And I had to come to terms with it. I had to. I mean, I was crying and I was feeling sad, but I didn't quite believe it. I almost spoke to him. I didn't quite, but I almost did, saying, "Where are you?" I knew very well where he was, but I didn't say it. And writing the story really led me to acceptance and peace. Even though it was painful to write, it was also cathartic. And the story is not all doom and gloom. I mean, I always seem to find the grace of humor in the most terrible situations. I can't help it. I think it has something to do with my upbringing, with my Yiddishkeit. I really feel that I remember even growing up in the Depression, and my father was out of work, that there was so much laughter in the house all the time. There was so much laughter at the edge of darkness, just as there was so much darkness at the edge of laughter. And I hope that that's all in my work. Thanks.
Thank you, Hilma. Thank you for sharing that, your story and your personal story. That was just beautiful. I'm now going to introduce the next author. And if you have questions for Hilma, put them in the chat, and we'll get to them in the Q&A section. Okay. Aviya Kushner grew up in a Hebrew-speaking home in New York. Her debut poetry collection, Wolf, Lamb, Bomb, by Orison Books, came out earlier this year, and it was named a new and noteworthy book by the New York Times. Her first book, The Grammar of God, A Journey into the Words and Worlds of the Bible, was published by Spiegel and Grau and was a National Jewish Book Award finalist, a Sammy Rohr Prize finalist, and one of Publisher Weekly's top 10 religion stories of the year. She is the Forward's language columnist and is an associate professor at Columbia College Chicago, where she directs the MFA program in creative writing. So I have to unmute you, ask to unmute, and I'm gonna pin your spotlight.
Hi, it's so lovely to be here. Thank you, Julie, for this beautiful invitation. And it's such an honor and delight to read with Hilma and Iddo. Hilma, I loved what you said about laughter at the edge of darkness, which I think characterizes so much Jewish literature. It's a beautiful, beautiful description. And it's wonderful to hear your new work. So thank you. I want to acknowledge, first of all, that I know a lot of people are surprised that I wrote a book of poems. I've been publishing prose actively for years. And so I just want to say that I've always written poetry along with prose, but I quickly discovered that prose pays more and is read by more people. So poetry has been my private world for a long time. I thought I would start by talking about how this book started and how these poems have accompanied me through the years. So like Hilma, this I now understand, I don't think I could have articulated at the time, but I now understand that this book began when my grandfather died. When my grandfather died, I was in my early 20s, and I was devastated when my grandfather died. And one of the things that really upset me was that there was nothing for me to do. You know, in Jewish tradition, there are folks who say Kaddish, there's Shiva, there's nothing for a grandchild. There's just nothing. What are you supposed to do? And I didn't like that. And so I made up my own ritual. And since my grandfather was a Yekka, he grew up in Germany, I decided that it had to involve being punctual, which is something that I am not. And I decided that I would go to shul on time every week for a year. And I would get there in time for the reading of the Torah and Haftarah, which has never happened before or since, and look at the entire thing again. And do that in honor of my grandfather. That was my made-up decision. And since my grandfather was very elegant and loved clothing and jewelry, I made sure to be super dressed up every week as if he were right there, and sometimes in the outfits that he had purchased for me, and I honored him in that way. And at that time, I was finishing a graduate degree in poetry. And so in my head, I was thinking about poems all the time. And so in that year in shul, when I was uncharacteristically on time, I was thinking to myself, hold on, Yeshayahu, forget the Jewish stuff. He's an incredible poet. He's such an amazing poet. He can absolutely hold up next to Auden, next to Shigzi's, these poets I was studying in school. And I was just bowled over by what an incredible poet Yeshayahu was, and I wanted to have a conversation with him. And so that's how this book started. I think I now realize, and I don't think I could have told you this then, but I now realize that for me, Yeshayahu and these poems, it was the place where my grandfather's life and my life and the Jewish people's life came together. And I say that because my grandfather grew up in a Hasidic family in Bremen, Germany. He was the only survivor of his entire family. And I was always intrigued by one key aspect of my grandfather's life, by the fact that he left religion and then returned to religion. And I think in many ways that mirrors a lot of the decisions of the Jewish people. And so I'm going to read for you a poem. I've actually never read it out loud in public before that imagines that aspect in particular. The poem is called Stupor. And as you can see, I'll just hold up for a second. You can see that the lines don't fit into a traditional page. The publisher had to move it over. And if you know Yeshayahu, you'll recognize that it's a riff of Yeshayahu Yudbet Pasuk Aleph, Odecha Hashem ki anafta bi. The poem is called Stupor. Stupor. I'm going to thank you one day because you got angry at me. I'm going to crawl back now, and I wouldn't have had to crawl on all fours if you hadn't hit me, which is how my grandfather lived. After his 4 brothers were killed, and his parents too, he gardened on Yom Kippur. But when his wife was struck too, 36 and lovely she was at her death. So he came back to God. Like Job, my grandfather was, the only one to live to tell, a man who talked directly to the heavens, who asked why and then didn't explode from the question. And I know something within me, something that saw that first headless man and the ones who followed, something that saw the burning bodies of Jerusalem erupt and the first city I knew crumble, something that saw the white sign flying over the entrance of the ancient city proclaiming, Jerusalem, do not fear. Something that was in my grandfather lives. I have lived to tell thee, which means I alone is sad, but not really right. One day I will finally stop gardening, will tumble out of my stupor and say, I am angry, I am raving mad. You have taken so much from me, and yet I know you last as my song, my friend, the maker of the sea, creator of the sun, the human, the hard wind, and the garden, and the land. So that was me thinking through my grandfather's decision, which always fascinated me. And I think you can hear that the book of Isaiah and the poetry of Isaiah accompany me through all of these things that, of course, I had no idea were going to happen. So I'm going to read a poem that I wrote after September 11th. I think you can hear in that poem a comment from the photographer I worked with when I wrote a column for the Jerusalem Post, and he said something to me that I never forgot. He said, after you see your first headless man, you will never be the same. And so I incorporated that comment in that poem. This is a poem called Smoke, and it features Sennacherib, who felt really, really far to me that year in Shul, that I was uncharacteristically on time. But I think as we've seen more and more authoritarians and getting more and more popular, some of these dictators of the past seem closer. So this is called Smoke. God will empty the land of you. The sword will rule your fields. Sennacherib will come and remove 10/12 of you, and you'll cry. Oh, you will cry, and you'll say, this is the end. There is no more. But no, this is the beginning of comfort. And I remember the days after the disaster, how quiet it was on the highways, how drivers let others pass, how even the Hudson seemed to mourn, and how we began to be thankful for mother and father and land and wallet, in that order, and how the smoke was followed by a mild winter, and how everything seemed more beautiful, I suppose, and temporary after the sword, after the worst. So that's just an example of how Yeshayahu, the book of Isaiah, was with me, and that is a combination of riffs off 2 points in Yeshayahu, Chaf Daled and Lamed Vav. So I wanted to go back to this question of poetry and prose and what the difference is. And I always wrote poems, and I always worked as a journalist. And there was a moment that I started to get frustrated with both of those forms. And that moment, strangely, was after the Dolphinarium bombing in Tel Aviv, which was one of the worst bombings of the Second Intifada. And one of my jobs at that time was to interview child victims of terror, which is a job I don't recommend to anyone. And so I was sent to the house. There were two sisters who were killed in that bombing, and I was sent to the shiva to try to talk to their youngest brother, who at the time was 14, and that was the age of my brother. And I sat there for over 2 hours, and I waited until he talked with me. And, the story was over. I wrote my piece, blah, 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 but I could not stop thinking about this kid and how he had gone from being the youngest child in a 3-child family to an only child, and how the news cycle moved on, and it really bothered me. And so I kept visiting for about a year. I went back and I visited him, and I started writing essays actually about that time, because I felt that journalism didn't look at aftermath enough. Journalism isn't as interested in the roots of something and in the aftermath, which is really what nonfiction does. So I started to write more nonfiction after that experience, because I just thought, hold on, this kid, his life goes on. What happened to him? But then years later, I realized that I was so wrong, that in my zeal to focus on the child, he just reminded me of my own brother, I had walked right past the mother of the children and past the grandmother, and they had come from the former Soviet Union, and so they really didn't speak Hebrew, and they didn't speak English. And I think because of that, I ignored them, because I was young and I wasn't really aware. And so years later, I wrote this poem, and it mixes the mother's perspective of the Delphinarium, which killed 21 teenagers, and Yeshayahu and my own, and it's called Disco. For those who don't know, the Dolphinarium was a nightclub, and it was aimed at those under 21. Disco, tell me, who made the world lie in waste? Who wrecked the villages one by one until only a lone woman was left? Smoke and fire, music, and the tick, tick, tick of aftermath. In the whitewashed apartment, a mother of 2 girl dancers has no hair to slick into buns, no necklaces to fasten at the neck. The bomb's cheap trick to unclasp it all. Who cocked the trigger? Who flicked the switch? Who rang the cell phone that flipped life into explosion? Once I was a singer who sang into the black night of the dance floor, the crystal ball shine of it. Now I alone am left to tell. I alone still have 2 legs to walk out into the flowerless world. I have left the village of my isolation to tell you I was a lone woman singing, dancing in the tick, tick, tick of the wreck, holding the word Delphinarium, saying daughters, anklets, daughters, saying this dance of a world was once my world. This wreck is my world. And I just want to acknowledge that as a young reporter, I had to stand there as this little boy went and brought in 2 lanyard anklets, and they were all that was left of his sister. They were his sisters. They were sort of made out of the rubber that children use in camp, and that was all he had. And it took him a while to talk about it. It took me a while to understand what he was showing me, and so that's what's in that poem. I want to close with one medium-sized poem and one shortish poem. And something that I'm asked a lot is, how do you write about history in a personal way? How do you do that? How do you make history relevant to other people? And I think that, sadly, the Holocaust, which is so present to so many people in the Jewish community, is so not a factor to many other people. We see these scary surveys that, like a third of the British or half the British don't know that the Holocaust happened or can't name a single concentration camp. In the US, a third of millennials were unaware of the Holocaust. I can say that I see this teaching all the time. People are unaware of the basic dates of the beginning and the end of World War II. So this is a poem that I wrote about somebody I knew when I was a child. When I was a child in the playground, there was someone who would try and talk to the children. And quite frankly, I thought he was creepy. He used to like this, and I didn't understand a word that he was saying because he never said any words. And only years later did I understand his story. And so I'm going to read this poem. And I want to say that I've gotten a lot of handwritten cards about this poem from many readers, and I want to acknowledge that. Called Rereading Chapter 11. Something is about to dry up the tongue of the Egyptian sea, just seconds after it looked like the wolf and the lamb were about to lounge together. And that's what frightens me, that God or whoever can just dry it all up, take it all away, which is what happened to the brother of the builder of my parents' house, who had his tongue cut out of his mouth at Auschwitz, which sent him into a life without sound, a sentence of being misunderstood. I think of the tongueless man every year on Yom Kippur, the holiest of the holy days, and what makes me tremble are the words, Lord, open my lips and let my mouth utter your praises. Humble, it's supposed to sound, and I know I need to ask for that opening of the lips. And then I remember the lines before that. Man has the inner workings of the heart, and God owns the tongue. But I want the tongue. That's all I want, to have one body part that is mine alone, to say, God, take it all, control the land, rule over me all my life. But don't take that. No, no, don't cut my tongue out. Not that. And it's Mr. Rubin who lost the ability to speak. And it's something that I think about a great deal, about that responsibility, that honor, that gift. I want to close with a poem that I hope will be comforting. And it's an example of what happens when you work on something for a very long time. When you work on something for a very long time, you end up writing pieces that reflect on what you were doing. And you start to, it's so weird. You're like, oh, I think I understand what I'm doing now. Whereas in the middle, you couldn't explain to anybody. You couldn't do that elevator pitch to save your life. So what I realized is that I was thinking about what poetry was and the space between poetry and prophecy. And I want to acknowledge I.B. Singer, who in his Nobel acceptance speech said that in the old Jewish writers, there was no difference between poetry and prophecy. So it's very short. I'm going to close with how to soothe. How to soothe. Speak to Jerusalem tenderly. Speak to her heart. Tell her quietly that it's over, that she suffered doubly for all her sins. Tell me, Isaiah, is your repetition confusion or just obsession with punishment? Nachamu, nachamu, comfort, oh comfort, you try later, as if to say, comfort can come more than once too. And maybe repetition is just that, comfort, oh and ooh, the hum of it, like earth's sway in the night, like the space between poetry and prophecy, ancient, circular, persistent. Thank you all.
Thank you, Aviya. That was beautiful. I have a lot to say, comments about your poetry, which I also read, by the way, a lot of the time when I brought it with me to shul. So, okay, 1 sec. I'm gonna introduce our last speaker. And oh, I have to ask you to unmute yourself. So, hold on. One sec. Where'd you go? Okay, so Iddo Gefen was born in 1992 in Israel and currently lives in Tel Aviv, although right now he's coming to us from New York, where he's on a big book tour. He works in neurocognitive research at the Immersive Media and Cognition Group in the Sagol Brain Institute, Soraski Medical Center, and Tel Aviv University, exploring how storytelling can improve our understanding of the human mind. Iddo leads an innovative study to diagnose aspects of Parkinson's disease using storytelling and augmented reality. Jerusalem Beach is his debut collection, and it was the recipient of the Israeli Minister of Culture Award in 2017. Iddo won the National Library of Israel's Pardes Scholarship for Young Writers, and his debut novel, Mrs. Lillenblum's Cloud Factory, will be published by Astra House in 2023. Is that right? 2023 or 2022? Film and TV rights of several stories from Jerusalem Beach were sold to leading Hollywood production companies. Wow, that's great. Okay, Iddo, take it away. Bakasha.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I just want to say it's so inspiring being on the same stage with Hilma and Aviya. And I really feel like listening to your stories, I feel like we're in the same tribe. Like I heard a lot of the things from my family of dealing with humor and grief, and also with using like the Bible and stuff you learn from your Jewish history inside your writing. So it's amazing for me. And Julie, just this project is just amazing. I'm now on a book tour around the States, and I see this great gap between Jewish Americans here to Israelis, and I think this Literary Modiin is an amazing place to maybe close this gap a little. So I'm here to talk about my short stories collection, Jerusalem Beach. And I want to start a little bit like Hilma and telling how I became a writer. And I came from a house where stories were always something very, very important. My grandfather, his name was Abba, father in Hebrew, and he lived in Jerusalem. He would tell a lot of stories about his childhood in Lithuania. And he had a brother, Joseph, that would always also tell stories. And there was only one problem. Joseph's stories were much better than my grandfather's. They were much more interesting. He was a much better storyteller. And the stories was always about their childhood. And I remember once that my grandfather, in the middle of Joseph's story, stopped him and said, "Joseph, one second only. Listen, this is an amazing story. Don't take me wrong. Really great. There's only one little problem. I was there. It didn't happen." And then Joseph looked at him seriously and said, "You know what? You're right. But that's how it should have happened." And then he continued telling the story, although we all knew it was completely fictional, as if it is completely true. So I think since I was a child, I understood good storytelling is a very important ability. But as a child, I didn't like reading it at all. And the reason is because I'm dyslexic. And for me, books were always something very hard to grasp. And even trying to understand what I'm reading about I always felt like at school, it's always a test to see if you understand, and you don't understand what you're reading. And I didn't understand. And one day my big sister, Michal, which was a real bookworm, decided that enough is enough and it's time for me to read. And about when I was 8 years old, she sat next to my bed at night and said, "Welcome everybody, today we're gonna read Harry Potter, the first book. Whoever in the audience wants to join are welcomed." I was the only one in the audience, and she was my big sister, so I didn't have any option but saying yes. But I thought she was very מעצבנת, annoying. I didn't understand what she wants from me. But as I'm sure many of you know, when you get into a good story, after a few chapters, I just fell in love with the book and the plot and Harry Potter and his story. And when we ended that story, I told her, "Okay, great, we'll meet tomorrow for the second book, right?" And then she said very smartly, "Yeah, but only if you read one page in every chapter." And that was the best deal I could get in those days. So that's how I found myself reading for the first time. But writing actually came to me only in high school. My real dream, and still is to be an NBA player. And if I would stand up, you would see I don't have the height to do that. And I think my parents were smart enough to know that. Then they convinced me that going to a science class would be a better thing to do. And while I was there, I tried to find myself and find ways to be a bit different from the other children, and writing for me was the way to do that. But I didn't know how to start writing because I don't know, I thought writing was something you do after your university and after you're very famous and know what you're doing. And so I think the only thing I could do, and that's what I did, I just Googled how to be an author on Google, and I found this photo of Ernest Hemingway with a typewriter and a glass of scotch. And then I said, okay, if this is good for Hemingway, this is probably would be good for me also. So the typewriter, that was easy. I found that in my grandfather and grandmother's house. About the scotch, years have passed, so now I can tell that in Ra'anana, the city where I was born and raised, there's a special supermarket that if you go there on Friday in the correct hour, you can buy alcohol with no ID. Now, I'm here on a book tour, and I speak a lot in universities, and here, as I understood, alcohol is only permitted from the age of 21. So a lot of the times after my lecture, students come to me, and I'm very glad that they liked my talk, and they say, yeah, it was very interesting. I only have one question. I'm coming on March to Israel, and I'm 20, so I just wanted to know, where is this supermarket you talked about? So that was my experience so far. But when I understood I wanted to write after my army service, I thought the best place to do that would be in a bookshop, because I had this fantasy of me reading books all day and having a lot of inspiration, and then at night I'll find myself writing, maybe with my typewriter and my glass of scotch. And then when I got into the bookshop, my boss said to me, congratulations, the first rule in our bookshop, and the most important one, is that you don't read during a shift. Never. So I immediately understood that I won't have the ability to read during a shift. And also, bookseller in Hebrew is mocher sfarim, and in both languages you have the word sell. You need to sell stuff, which I didn't think of when I applied to the job, and I was very bad in that. Till this day, I'm not so good in that part. So I wasn't so good. And the only thing I understood is that the most important thing for a bookseller in Israel is to know how to wrap nice presents, because that's very important. You cannot read at all, but if you know how to wrap a good present, the clients would be very happy. And I broke a record in our bookshop when one day one of the customers, as you know, Israelis are very sincere and are very honest. So while I was trying to wrap a present, he took his hand, put it on the book, on the wrapping page, and just said, listen, kid, there are stuff that you are not meant to do. Give it to me. And he wrapped the present instead of me. So I understood that wasn't a career I can follow. But what I did do very good in those times was just being on Facebook and looking at my friends in my phone. And I had this feeling when I looked under social media that everybody was much more successful than me. I had friends that went to a trip after the army, and one became a pilot, and one started a startup. And I always thought, like, I'm so far from that. And I think today we're much more aware, and I know this also from my position in research, that social media has a lot of bad influence to its users. But then I think it was something that was less known, and I didn't understand this gap, because everybody is also so successful and I'm not all the time. So I found stories, again, the only way I can maybe find a way to explore this question. And that's what I love about writing so much, that it allows you to ask questions and you don't have to get with a good answer in the end. Not like the lab where I work in research and you have to get a yes or no answer. Writing, I think the best books I read don't have a clear answer in the end. And the most important thing is the question. And the story I wrote that really helped me a little bit is about a guy who uses social media to create a completely other reality. And he posts there that he's a very successful artist in Berlin, and he has a lot of audience and a lot of friends, and he parties all day. And in the middle of the story, you understand that he actually only lives in Hadera, which is a very nice city, but I assume most of you would agree that it's not interesting as Berlin. And that once a year he goes to Berlin, takes a lot of photos, and then he has two lives, one in the virtual world and one in the real world. And I think that's something that a lot of people in my age feel a lot, this gap. And I think for me, stories is a way to try to play with this gap. And I think Amos Oz said that people read books from two reasons. One is to go to a place they have never been to, and that can be a culture or another place, another country. And the other reason is to go back to a place they have been to. And this place can be physically, but it can also be emotionally. And I think when I write, I try to balance between those in a sense that, like, I write about this guy that changed his life in social media. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't tell I'm living in Berlin while I'm living in Ra'anana or Tel Aviv. But I think the feeling of knowing how you feel when you want to impress somebody and you don't know how, and you want to do it the best way you can, that's something I can write about. So I try to connect between those themes. And I think also this book tour made me understood a lot of interesting things between the gap between Israel and the States. And just one interesting example I found is that here, one of my stories is called Exit. And if you can just think for a moment, what is the meaning of exit of the word for you? Now, I assume that if you're American, you would say leave, go out from somewhere, maybe end something. While my Israeli audience, when I asked them what is the meaning of exit, 90% of them would say selling a startup company to a bigger company. Because in Israel, there's a very known phrase, doing an exit, which means that you start a startup company, a small one, and then you work hard for a few years and then sell it to a big company, like Waze was sold to Google. And I think for my generation, for a lot of young Israelis, this is today the Israeli dream. A lot of my friends are starting to work on startups or build their own startups and hope that by the age of 40, they'll be in the Caribbean with millions of dollars. So I thought this is a gap between the cultures. And the reason the story is called Exit is because it's about a girl who decides to live inside her own dreams. She starts writing her dreams and starts dreaming every day more and more. And the reason she's doing that is because her father is trying to build a startup company and do an exit. So in fact, her way of trying to exit reality is her way of rebelling against the way her father lives. And for example, that's something that only when I came here I understood the term exit is not known, because it's when you said it in Hebrew, you say it in English, you don't say yetziah, you say exit. So I was sure it's an American phrase. So just one interesting thing I learned here. And the book is called Jerusalem Beach. And as you know, not all of my American audience knows, there's no beach in Jerusalem. And the reason it's called like that is because it's a short story about a couple who is searching for the beach in Jerusalem. And they're doing that because the woman in the story, Lillian, has Alzheimer's. And one of the only memories she has left is her as a child visiting the beach of Jerusalem. And her husband, Sammy, knows this is probably an illusion. It's not something real. And again, this is something I know more today also from my research, that a lot of people with Alzheimer's have illusions about things that they thought happened but didn't happen. But one day he decides, what will happen if I'll go with this fantasy? And he takes her to Jerusalem, and they're looking for the beach. And I want to read you one short part from the story about Sammy's regret of not believing Lillian when they were younger regarding this memory. And it goes like this. To this day, Sammy still regrets what he said to her back then. It's probably just a dream, he determined, and then added with certainty. There was not been a beach here in years, and and also not snow. Since then, she no longer shared with him the chronics of her first memory. At first, he believed it was only a matter of time till she would be convinced to tell her about the beach again. But over the years, he learned how stubborn she could be. No, it doesn't make no difference how many times he apologized and begged, she persevered in her silence. Even after they came to know each other's bodies, even after they got married, and even decades later, when they moved to a retiring home in the other side of town, she claimed such a memory was too precious to place in the hands of another, even if of a loved one. Then came the Alzheimer's and ripped out the memories one by one. Their honeymoon in Rome, their evening in the Chinese restaurant, the traffic ticket she received on Highway 2, their son's death, the taste of pistachio ice cream, the first cigarette they smoked together, the war and the one that followed, her father's voice, the dog they adopted for 3 days only to discover it belonged to the neighbors, the trip to the Vid stream in Engedi and the moment she slipped and fell, the 2 years in Boston, the round-down bathrooms in the Hebrew University, her fear of death, the very specific way she liked her coffee, the opening of Anna Karenina, the day she met Sammy. And one of the most amazing things that happened is that after this book was published in Hebrew, a friend of my father, his name was Yuval, and he told me that he liked the book very much, and he brought it to his father. And when his father saw the cover in Hebrew and he saw Jerusalem Beach, Chofam Shel Yerushalayim, he was very moved, very excited, and Yuval didn't understand why, because he didn't know about the book, he didn't know what it is about, and he started talking to him, and then he understood that his father was actually a geologist all his life, and as a young man, he worked in the mountains of Jerusalem looking for fossils there. And millions of years ago, there was actually a ocean in the place Jerusalem stands today. And he said, like, he didn't talk about it for so many years, but then when he saw the cover of the book, he said, I feel this book was written specially for me. And I think the amazing thing about that I understood that when we write fiction or poetry, we a lot of the time write about stuff that didn't happen, and like the stories of Joseph and my family. But when the story reaches somebody else, it sometimes can get into emotional truth that is real, and like puts the layer that you find yourself in your own personality. And I think that's the strength of good storytelling and fiction, is the ability to connect between human beings. And that's always also the reason when I started university, I thought I wanted to learn literature. And although I still love literature very much, I understood that my real passion is human beings, and that's why I'm learning neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, because I think literature, and at its best, enables us to connect between each other, and that's just amazing thing and that's why I love writing and reading so much. So thank you.
That was great. That was great. So much to say. Okay, I'm gonna add spotlight. First of all, while I'm doing this, I'll just say, Iddo, that apropos exits and dyslexia, my day job that actually is for an Israeli startup that works in the field of special ed and helping kids
Oh,
with students with dyslexia and speech language
wow.
issues. And someday maybe we'll have an exit. Who knows?
Wow, that's amazing. So I'd love to learn more
Yeah.
also. Like I wish I had something like that when I was a child.
Okay, and just on your last point, actually, it reminded me of what Hilma was saying about good fiction is truth wrapped in a lie. So
So
I think
completely.
you were all speaking kind of about some of the same things. We do have some questions in the chat. Let me just go back and get them. I'll start with a question for Hilma. It's so refreshing to read a story that so honestly describes grief. Were there other works that influenced you while you were writing this story?
I wasn't reading as much then in that depression, that sadness following my husband's death. I really just felt compelled to tell our particular story. And I think that fiction really is, when I read fiction I like, it has a universality, even if it takes place in a place I've never been with people I've never might ever meet. There's a shock of recognition. I'm sure I've read many books, A Death in the Family, James Agee, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. These were all books that had influenced me over the years, but I think it was my personal story that influenced me more than anything else, and that I just had to put it down. And I'd never had that experience before, but it was, I guess, losing one's husband after 68 years is probably the most major event of my life.
Okay, there was an earlier question for Iddo. Can you tell us more about the experience of a dyslexic writer and whether the theme of overcoming this appeared in your work?
Yeah, definitely. I think it influenced my writing a lot. One example is like the first story in the book is about 60 pages long, and there's 30 episodes in it, chapters. And like after the book was published, somebody asked me, why are there chapters every 2 pages? And I didn't think about it while I was writing, but afterwards I thought about that when I was a child, the most frustrating thing for me is to read a book that I have no place to stop in it. So I did, like, I think something even a bit more extreme, and did a lot of stops during the reading because it was something that was so important for me. And I think in a more general sense, it makes me think more about the reader in my process, because again, I remember my first reading experiences as something very frustrating. And I know a lot of writers who talk about how for them writing is the most important part in the process, and the publication is only something that comes after and is not the main thing. And I have to admit that for me, I don't feel like that. I feel like the most important part in the process of writing is when the book gets to the reader and he reads it, and the connection between your story and the reader's associations is the most important thing for me. So I feel that good literature for me is connecting, and like the best books I read are the ones where I felt that an author made me understand a feeling that I felt, but he or she put it into words, and that's something very strong for me. So I think my dyslexia is something that was very hard in the beginning, made me all the time think of how can I make my writing accessible for readers in general, and specifically for those that reading doesn't come so easy to them.
That's great. That's great. Okay, there is another question. There's it, Avi Landis. Asked Hilma, do you and Meg read each other's work? And if so, at what stage?
We read first drafts. We totally trust each other. I have to say, she began writing as a child. And because I was a writer, she gave me her work. And because I was her mother, I loved it. Not only was it good, but it was thrilling for me to just read it. And I kept praising her and praising her. And one day she actually said to me very angrily, "You just love everything I do." And I realized that she wanted to be treated with more respect, that she wanted to be treated as a peer, as a writer. So I gave her some criticism. And of course, she began to cry. So I had to find some happy medium between honesty and charity, which for me carried over when I began to teach in a workshop. I felt you had to tell the truth to be helpful to the writer, but you also had to be aware of the writer as a human being behind that story with a very fast beating heart, hoping everyone will love it and feeling personally assaulted if people hate it. And so that helped. But Meg and I read each other's work. She's been both of my children were very helpful in the publication of this book, because recovering from COVID, I've forgotten that in publication, you don't just send your book in and then it's printed. You have to look at it. I had 6 passes on this book. You writers will know what I mean. I had to read the entire manuscript over and over again, looking for errors. And because these stories had never been all together, I had to look for repetitions. We all have tics and things like that. So Meg and Nancy both read every one of those passes. And because Nancy had been a production manager at Oxford University Press, she knew all about the Chicago Manual of Style, and she was very helpful about things like that. And Meg, as a novelist, as a fiction writer, was very helpful about content. And so we do read each other's work, and we are very honest. And for me, it's very easy to be honest about her because she's a terrific writer. I mean, not only are they terrific authors, but they're very good artists as well.
That's great. That's great. Do you all have questions for each other that you've been like dying to ask?
I'm a little curious, Aviya, about the fact that you wrote a lot of prose, you said. Did I hear you correctly that it was nonfiction?
Correct. Yeah. I also write fiction, but I've published a lot of nonfiction. Yes, correct.
You're writing,
Correct.
are you writing fiction secretly? Private?
Sort of. I hope I finish this novel in my lifetime. I hope so.
Me too. I'd like to read it. I have to say a couple of things about what I heard. The
Sure.
line that your grandfather didn't explode from the question, I thought was a wonderful line. And that devastating poem in which there's a flowerless world, that was a great moment for me. And I felt that I could step right into the poem, that I didn't need to be educated about them first. I could just read them and have a visceral reaction, which I want to have, when I hear poetry and when I hear fiction. And Iddo, I had the same feeling in listening to you. And I thought the whole notion of Alzheimer's and something that doesn't exist except in this person's fantasy, and yet somebody else has an historical memory of it, was just brilliant. You're both such brilliant young people. I have to tell you, you mentioned when you were born, Iddo, and my grandson is older than you are. My older grandson is older than you are, so you can just imagine. Where there's a great generation gap, and yet I find such pleasure in reading you. And I'm hoping that you don't have to be old to enjoy my work.
Oh,
No,
Definitely
no,
not. Definitely not.
no, I have to say, both of your talks were so inspiring. And again, like, as I told in my talk, like the most important thing for me in books and reading is the connection. And I feel very strongly in both of your talks that like connecting to the place you came from or to your readers is something so important. So amazing and inspiring. Like I still didn't have the chance to read the books, and yet I felt I got such an amazing glimpse into it, and it's so amazing. And Hilma, I'm interested to know your like, how is the feeling of reading something you wrote almost 50
Yes.
years ago, and
Yes. Great
having
question.
the
It is a good-
perspective you have today as a writer with all the things you know, like how does it feel to read it again?
It's a very good question. First of all, I was shocked by some of the details. There were no computers, there were no cell phones. The most dismaying thing to me was that none of the women had jobs outside of their housewifely duties. And yet, I thought that young people really couldn't connect with those old stories. And when it went to the publisher, my editor had very young women in the office read the stories, and they immediately connected to them, because it's the inner lives of the women, I think, that keep going through the generations, all of our inner lives. And I happen to believe that everyone has an interesting inner life. I had
So true.
I had a psychiatrist friend who said, no, they don't. I wouldn't have chosen her for a psychiatrist.
Helma, am I remembering correctly that your husband was a psychologist?
Yes.
Is that right?
He was
Yeah.
a psychologist, and he moonlighted occasionally as a jazz musician. He played saxophone and clarinet. My younger grandson just took his saxophone. He's a musician as well. And in addition to missing him personally, I miss him as a great resource for me, because not only did he have a lot of information and could always come up with a word when I couldn't come up with a precise word, I would call out to him, but he gave me all this information about music. He gave me all this information about psychology, all the things he knew, and it's gone. I mean, I can't ask him anymore. I'm doing an interview with a British podcast, and they're asking about people I thought should be better known. And one of the people I mentioned was a jazz pianist named Mary Lou Williams. And I remember hearing her play. But when they asked me, well, what did you think of her stride piano? I need to ask my husband. And I can't. So that is another loss, another layer of loss.
There was another question in here in the chat, which I missed before, for Aviya. Are you influenced by biblical texts in your prose as well as poetry? If yes, which texts in particular? And I'll just add to that, saying when I heard you speak, maybe it was a month ago at a different event, and I was like, oh my God, and now I'm inspired to go back and read the book of Isaiah. And when I was reading books and it was on Shabbat, so I was just like, putting the pages down of things that struck me. And anyway, but you can answer the other question.
Well, thank you, Julie, for that. And thank you, Hilma, for that beautiful comment. So moving to me. So to answer your question, yes, in the past, I'm not sure about in the future. So I wrote this book called The Grammar of God, which is about the experience of reading the Tanakh in English after a whole life of reading it in Hebrew. So Iddo, just as there's a huge gap between, I think, Jews in Israel and in the United States, that's mirrored in a massive gap in the Torah and the Tanakh and what people think it is. So that was, but I kind of think between that and these poems, I'm sort of maxed out, and the next project won't be that way. But yeah, if you feel like reading prose about it, there's The Grammar of God and 10 years of my life. Yes. Yeah.
Wow, this is great. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions, or do you guys want to ask each other anything else? You guys will wrap up.
Aviya, I just want to know, like, when you read as a child, it was in English and then Hebrew, or like, how did you come to?
Yeah. So I grew up speaking Hebrew. Yeah, my mother's here. I can wave. Yeah, so I always read the Tanakh in Hebrew. I went to yeshiva, depending on how you look at it. And I honestly, I don't think I even, just the concept of an English, it wasn't even on my radar in any way. And I went to Iowa for my MFA. And when I went in, I was open-mouthed, astonished. I took a class on the Bible and translation. The first semester was the Old Testament. The second was the New Testament. I was just like, I was just in shock. And I realized, not just from the text, but from the questions that my fellow writers were asking, I realized this isn't the same book. There's a huge gap. And I thought to myself, because I had just come from Jerusalem, from Yerushalayim, and I'd worked as a reporter, I was like, wait a second, this gap has a huge effect on world politics, on history, on law. Someone needs to comment. So that was the book. Yeah.
That's so interesting because like I never read it in English actually.
Be
So now
shocked.
that's the first thing I'm gonna do because like I never thought about it that way. That's so interesting.
I recommend, I know this sounds weird, but I recommend that all Jewish readers, especially those who are interested in Israel, read evangelical translations of the Tanakh. Everyone should read it, and you'll understand so much. So I recommend it. And remember, it sold 450 million copies, more than every person in the United States.
Wow.
Yep.
A friend of mine who is I think a great Jewish scholar, Francine Klaxbrun. I don't know if you know of her.
I know her.
She wrote the biography of Golda Meir, which won the American Jewish Book Award and so forth and so on. She formed a little group of writers, friends, to study the Bible. And what we did, we didn't get very far because we read a passage and talked about it endlessly. And I discovered the difference in the translations, which really disturbed me. Right in the beginning, the serpent, in her book, the serpent was the slyest of creatures. In mine, which I preferred, the serpent was the subtlest of creatures, which I thought was a really interesting difference.
Totally. Check out Slavery in multiple translations.
Wow.
And then listen to the American conversation. Check out and the Hebrew, check out the Hebrew, and then the various English translations, and then tune in to whatever's going on right now. It's very illuminating and explains a lot. Yep.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to our three authors tonight, Hilma, Aviya, and Iddo. It was great listening to you and hearing you read your work. And to everybody on the call, on the Zoom, thank you for your questions. And be sure to go out and get their books and read them. I don't have all the details yet, but save the date because I think our December event is going to be on December 12th after Hanukkah. So save the date, same, it's always on a Sunday. It's always at 8 o'clock in Israel, 8 p.m. Israel time and 1 p.m. Eastern time. And as I said, if you missed part of this, I'm going to be sending out the recording and also the links to where you can buy their books tomorrow. So thank you again, everyone. This was great. And thank you especially to Iddo, Aviya, and Hilma.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Okay. Happy
Glad to meet you
Thanksgiving
all.
and happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you for all the comments you wrote. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
It was lovely.